John and Gay worshiped with us for a long time, and went to serve at other smaller congregations. I poured out the last of 7 3/4 inches of rain this morning.
Wow.
Through last week. I don't know what y'all got. I talked to a friend in Llano Friday, and they'd only had 3/4 of an inch, and he was kind of jealous. But a lot of rain, tanks running around, and nice spring morning. It's a good day to be alive, good day to be in worship. I'm going to give George an opportunity for redemption. He had a hard time with the question last week. So in just a minute, I'm going to give you a question. You've got a 50-50 chance of answering. Right. A number of years ago, a friend of mine was driving from Stephenville to Granbury. She had worked at the home. She was going back home. And not far out of Toller, her check engine light came on her vehicle. So she pulls off to the side of the road and calls her husband. What did he tell her, George? What do you think he told her?
Call a tow truck.
No. What most men would say would be what? I'll keep going. Those things come on all the time. Except this time the oil pump had stopped working. And so what happened a few miles down the road?
Engine blew up.
Engine just seized because it had no lubrication of oil flowing around. So George, I don't know that I'm going to ask you any more questions.
Thank you.
She had a light that came on that some people call them idiot lights, but it gave a warning, and she heeded the warning. She did right. Her husband was the one that dismissed it. And sometimes I wish we had a light, and I think we do. I think it's called our conscience. A warning that comes on that says, maybe we need to check our attitude about things. Maybe we need to stop and slow down and say, whoa, let's look at things, let's check the status of things before we go any further. One of those lights, I think, would be an attitude warning light about our ideas of authority. I saw something on the news in Houston. I was in Houston for a couple of weeks ago, and it fit perfectly into the idea of what I'm wanting you to see this morning. It has nothing to do with masks, although the masks are in the story, but it has nothing to do with that. The importance is a lot deeper than that. There was a restaurant, and the interview of the owner of the restaurant, he had required masks in this particular establishment. I don't know if it was in Houston or where. And so they interviewed different people, and people said, yeah, that's fine. If he wants to require that, we'll wear the mask. Well, the camera then panned to a table of a family of 4. Father and mother and 2 kids. I think 2 kids maybe between 10 and 15 years of age. And they panned them praying in thanks for their food. And then after the prayer, the reporter went over and asked the family, what do you think about the requirement of masks? And the woman got this defiant look on her face and said, I think they ought to burn them all. She said, no one is going to tell me what to do. Now I want you to think about that. They had just prayed to God. And then she verbalizes the statement that no one's going to tell me what to do. So I'm left to wonder, does God tell you what to do, or do you listen to Him, or is He one that's also outside your realm of authority? Do you not listen to Him? But the disparity between ostensibly the subservience to God, but then this defiance to a rule that was put in place by this eating establishment. To me, that perfectly pictured an issue I see that is a huge issue, and it has nothing to do with masks. Masks may be a symptom of it or an element of it. It has to do with our attitude toward authority. Our attitude toward authority structures. We got some kids in here, and I'm going to blow Emily's bubble, and your bubble, and yours, the younger ones, by telling you this. When you get 18 and you leave home, you're not going to be on your own, and you're not going to get to call the shots, and you're not going to get to do all the things you want to do. I'll tell you that right now and just shatter that illusion. Because when you get 18 and leave home, you're going to be under someone else's rules, and you're going to be under someone else's oversight, and you're going to get a paycheck stub, and you're going to find out that the government took money out of your paycheck that you didn't get, and you're going to be frustrated with that because you're going to say, that's my money. There is not a time in life from the cradle to the grave that we are not under the authority of someone or some group or some structure. There is never a time in life when we are completely out from under authority. Some people ask me when I left the role of president at Foster's Home to another role, how it was not being the one that was the big boss. They use the phrase big boss. Well, I'll tell you what it is. I went from having 16 bosses to having one boss. So I love it. I had a board of directors of 16 men and women that governed my role and did a good job of that and corrected me when I needed correcting. But going from 16 to 1 is pretty nice. I just have one boss to please instead of 16. Point being, in that position of being the big boss, I was still under authority. I was still under submission to authority above me. I want to read a story in 1 Samuel 15 because there's a lot of common sense wisdom in it. Saul is appointed king over Israel. God really had another choice in mind, but people wanted Saul, and so Samuel appointed Saul. He's given the instructions to go destroy the Amalekites. Utterly destroy them. Destroy everything about them. And so Saul defeats the Amalekites, verse 7, 1 Samuel 15. And he captures Agag, king of the Amalekites, alive. And he utterly destroys all the people with the edge of the sword. And that word but comes in, verse 9. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the fatlings, the lambs, and all that was good. They were not willing to destroy them utterly, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. In a way, I can understand Saul's actions. You go into this other country, you vanquish them by military might, you capture the king as a sign of subservience, you have won the battle, and then you've got all of these animals and all of this wealth. It'd be like telling Kenneth to go kill all the Herefords in his pastures. And that just doesn't make sense. Why would we waste all of those animals? And the lesser of the animals they killed, but the best of the animals they kept. And I don't really know what Saul's rationale was. There's a little bit of indication in it, but my guess is they thought, man, these things we could offer to God. I mean, that may have been their excuse that they were going to do that. So Samuel meets Saul, and Samuel says, what is this sound I hear in my ears about the crying out of animals, the bleating of sheep and the lowing of oxen? And Saul says in verse 15, they. Now he's shifting blame to the people. They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and the oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God, but the rest we have utterly destroyed. Kind of a whole different sermon in there about Saul not taking responsibility for what happened. You know, the people were the ones that brought the animals back. They had a good reason. They're going to sacrifice them to God. But we, myself included, we destroyed all that we were told to destroy. Well, baloney, because he left the king. He captured the king. Anyway, the whole point coming down to verse 22 that Samuel makes to Saul in this, it's not about oxen. It's not about animals. It's not about sacrifices to God. He says, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. Now here's the kicker in verse 23. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. That is some serious, serious words. We talk about satanic things. We talk about a realm of darkness that exists, and it does. I don't fully understand it, but I know that that realm exists because Paul says that we're fighting against the realm of darkness, the powers of darkness. Samuel says to disobey is on a par with dabbling in that satanic stuff, with divination and idolatry. You know, the idea of somebody worshiping an idol that they crafted. We just can't understand that. He said, neither does God understand insubordination. I mean, from the time we were raised up, I don't know about you, but I was raised in a family where if mom or dad said to do something, then I did it. And if I didn't do it, then I paid the consequences from that. And sometimes I was a slow learner, and it took consequences 2 or 3 times before I finally got the lesson. They really mean what they say. And I really have to do what they tell me to do. I didn't have the choice as a young boy or as an adolescent to say, hi, take it or leave it. I don't want to do what Dad says today. Never had that freedom to do that. Because I learned in the structure in the family I grew up in, you do what your parents tell you to do. Paul says the same thing in Ephesians. He said, children, obey your parents. That's first commandment with a promise. He said, for this is right, and it's the first commandment with a promise. Somewhere lost in this translation of allegiance to God, we lose the idea that we also have an allegiance to what God says. I would have loved in that restaurant for the reporter to have asked a few more questions. It says, how can you pray to a God and make yourself subservient to God, but you don't do the things that the God tells you to do? And the lady would have said, well, what do you mean that I'm not doing what the God tells me to do? Well, the reference, there's 2 texts we're going to look at. One in Romans 13 and one in 1 Peter 2. Those are 2 primary chapters that focus at length on what I'm talking about this morning. We're not going to examine them in detail. Each one could be a sermon in and of itself. But in Romans 13, Paul says this, let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, because of that premise in verse 1, he who resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, for they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. Now that's, we can say, well, that's first century, that's way back then. But here's the truth of it. The context that Paul says those words, he didn't live in a representative democracy. He didn't live in a country where you got to pick your leaders, where you got to vote on things, where you got to express ideas and freely exchange ideas and build a republic that is represented by representatives of the people. He didn't live in anything close to America. He lived in the Roman Empire. He lived in a country that was governed by a dictator. He lived in a country that was governed by an oppressive dictator. He lived in a country that was ruled by a succession of Caesars, one of which was Nero Caesar, around 70 AD, who had a long history of horrific acts against God's people. And in the context of that kind of country, of that kind of environment, Paul says, let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities. Even in a Roman dictatorship, Paul says the right thing to do is to be in subjection because that authority exists from God. It is allowed to exist by Him. He says that's why it's necessary to be in subjection, verse 5, not just because of the wrath of them against wrongdoers, but for conscience sake. Because of this you pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Well, that's ironic. Do you think the rulers of the Roman Empire saw themselves as being servants of God? No, they didn't see themselves that way. But here's the key thing. God saw them that way. Whether they realize it or not, they're fulfilling a purpose that God has in civil life of maintaining order. and a semblance of structure. That's why Paul said in a few verses after that, earlier in 3 and following, rulers aren't a cause of good behavior, they're a cause of fear for bad behavior. If you want to have no fear of authority, here's what you do. You do what's right. And civil government's not going to have any problem with it. It's the same thing Peter will say in 1 Peter chapter 2 later. But the context that Paul says those words in is not that you had this great government that existed, that gave its blessings to the church and made worship and subservience of Jesus be a popular thing. It did the opposite of that. But even when world history is filled with nations with godless rulers, God's people still submitted. And I'm thinking back to the days of Daniel, back in Nebuchadnezzar's days, when they threw people into fiery furnaces. They burned people alive for what they did. And yet God, through Nebuchadnezzar, worked his will and allowed Daniel to rise to prominence, and the whole story historically of what happened with God's people is recorded back in Daniel. But it wasn't a government that we would have said would have been a good government. It was a horrible government, same as Roman government. But the truth is, Paul still says, let every person be in subjection to the governing authorities. In 1 Peter 2, almost a similar exact vein of thought. And if you remember what Peter writes against in his letters, he writes in the first verse of chapter 1, first several verses, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as aliens, scattered throughout Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Scattered because of what? What scattered God's people that Peter wrote to? Oppression, persecution, fiery trials he will write about. I used to have it, remember, I think it's 190 square miles, but I think it's more than that. The regions that he talks about where God's people are scattered around. He writes against the backdrop of some hard times for God's people. And in that context, he says this in chapter 2. In verse 11, I urge you as aliens and strangers to abstain from fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. Keep your behavior excellent among the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you as evildoers, they may, on account of your good deeds as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. Submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether to a king as the one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you may silence the ignorance of foolish men. Same context Paul writes against. Persecution, problems, a government that doesn't make it easy to be Christians. And yet Peter says, you keep your behavior excellent, you live right, you do right in whatever society you're in. And by doing right, you silence the ignorance of foolish men. So, the question is, how do we live in a world that is anti-Christ and anti-gospel and anti-spiritual things? The answer is, you live in submission and you do what's right. It doesn't change anything about the way that we live. Peter didn't say, I want you to go out and march in the streets against this horrible government that exists. He says, I want you to submit and do the right thing and live right. There was an old preacher named Ed Hedrick out of Abilene. Call him old, he was older than me. He had this phrase that he said all the time. He says, there is no substitute for right living. If he'd say that once, I bet I heard him say that 100 times in gospel meetings and sermons. There is no substitute for right living. Just the essence of doing right, of yielding where we need to yield, of submitting where we need to submit. Peter says, silence is the ignorance of foolish men. Here's the crux of it. You do that whether you want to do it or not. Because we're doing it not for our sake. Peter says we submit for the Lord's sake to every human institution. He's not asking us our opinion about things. He says you're doing it for God's sake. You're doing this because God says this is what I asked you to do for me. You know how we do what our parents ask us to do because we want to please them? Is that right, Emily? What we do? Yeah, good answer. Emily got it right, George. We do what our parents ask us to do because we want to make them happy. We want mom and dad to be proud of us. We want mom and dad to smile at us. We want mom and dad to brag about us to their friends. We do that because we want our parents to be happy. Doesn't that translate to God when God asks us to do something for His sake? Can't we suck it up and do what He asks us, even if it's not what we want to do? That's not hypocrisy. That is actually an expression of the deepest love you can have. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments. The highest love we can have is to do what we're asked to do, even and especially when we don't want to do it. That is what's called agape love. That is the love of commitment that says, I'm going to do it devoid of feelings and emotions. I'm going to do it because it's the right thing to do. I'm going to do it because God said to do it. And it's that attitude that ought to be reflective of God's people in a world that asks us to do things that sometimes we'd rather not do. I don't like to wear a mask. But you know what? If a store has a sign out front that says we require you to do it, I'm not going to make that my battleground where I say I'm not going to do that. I can do that for God's sake. I can do right and do whatever that store asks me. That has nothing to do with God. That has everything to do with doing what He asked me to do for His sake and yielding in submission to authority. Peter will go on down and say in verse 18, servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect. And here's the kicker to the slaves, not only to those who are good and gentle, even when your master is unreasonable. He said, this finds favor if for the sake of conscience toward God, a man bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. And then he ends up in chapter 2 with the supreme example of submission to authority. The supreme example or illustration is what Jesus did at the cross. Did Jesus want to go to the cross? Did He just skip and jump and smile all the way up to the cross? No. He prays in the garden 3 times. If there is any other way around this, I want to take the detour. I want the alternate route. I want to take the county road rather than the highway to the cross. And after 3 times, he resigned himself that there was no other way around what God had asked him to do. And so as the ultimate example of submission, Jesus goes to the cross, even when He didn't want to do it. And make no mistake, no one wanted to walk to the cross and be glad that's where they were going. People were crucified every day in Roman government. And there wasn't anything giddy about Jesus doing that, but He did it because it was the right thing to do. And so the supreme example of doing what's right, even when you don't want to, is right there in 1 Peter 2. You look at the model of Jesus. So it'd be kind of foolish to say, I'm not going to do what somebody tells me to do. No one's going to tell me what to do. When you have the Son of God who did the supreme example of submission and obedience by going to the cross, that kind of makes an argument about a mask a silly thing. Truth be told, in life, we've always had rules to go by. I mean, I can remember as a kid, no pants, no shirt, no shoes, no service. We didn't argue about that. You didn't go in Dairy Queen barefoot, because the Dairy Queen, back in my day, the old days, had the Queen's rules of the day on the wall. You're grinning, you remember that. First one was no profanity. Took me a long time to realize what profanity was. And the Queen had other rules. No loitering. I didn't know what loitering was. I thought loitering was this big bad deal. Well, it's just hanging around. We don't have anything to do. And the Queen had her orders of the day. That was in the 1960s. We've always had rules. We've always submitted to those rules. But for some reason now, indicative of society's respect or lack of respect for authority, we raise all of these issues about things that are minor things. You know, it's like the check engine light. The light ought to be blinking in a lot of people's minds. Check your attitude toward authority. There's something amiss here. You need to stop. You need to pull off. You need to check things out. You need to examine things and say, you know what? I need to realign my priorities with God. I need to realign my actions with what He says. Because we can't love God and not do what He says. So I want you to take away the idea this morning, not that civil government is always right, and not that we can't question things around us. We can always question authority, but there are ways we live and ways we do, and there are ways we don't do that. We don't do that by riot and protest and by insurrection. We do it by living right. By living right, you silence the ignorance of foolish men. By living right, you have all the blessing of government, because they don't have to worry about the people who do right. They exist for the punishment of those who do wrong. And God's people stand out not for their wrongdoing, but they stand out for their right doing. So be committed this morning to having the godly attitude toward authority, the attitude that Jesus had, the attitude that He instructs us to have, of being in submission for God's sake to whatever level of authority is over you. Doing that glorifies God. Doing that makes Him smile. Doing that makes Him proud to be our spiritual Father. And as He told the Hebrews in Hebrews 11, God is not ashamed to be called their God, of people who submit and people who live right. So this morning, if there's some need you have to respond spiritually to make things right, we would ask you to come while we stand and sing.